good morning to everybody, and also good morning to people listening to us in the darknet. I'm actually also working for the University of Marburg, which is maybe a bit easier to pronounce. It's a great pleasure for me that you're having me here. I have actually tried to put together pieces from synthesis and open questions. So the keynote tries to bridge like the evidence that we have about disturbance effect on biodiversity, linked to ecological theories and background, and I'm highlighting a few gaps in knowledge, I would say. That's a picture from burned forest in Australia. It's a eucalypt forest. It's burned by the Black Saturday fire, one of the most intense and widespread fires in the last 20 years, with over 100 people dying in the disturbance, and with thousands of hectares of old-growth eucalypt forest have been killed. As you can see, up to the horizon, everything is plenty of burns, like trees up to 70 meters height. It was very traumatic, and it demonstrated the extreme impact that natural disturbances can have in forest ecosystems, even in old growth forest systems, with dramatic consequences actually for biodiversity and also for people living in or adjacent those forests. But on the same time, disturbances have a crucial role for dynamics in forests, for biodiversity. Here's the picture of Peucynota variolosa. It's almost extinct in Germany, and it's depending on injured or disturbance-killed aspen trees, as you can see here. And we have disturbance in various intensities, and one of the most famous, probably in Central Europe, is the bark beetle, which has generated extreme debates, not only in Germany, but also here, in Białowieża, where I actually took these pictures of sanitary fellings close to the road. And the background picture is actually from the Czech and German border, from the Bavarian Forest National Park, where we had the discussion around 40 years ago, and now in the extinction zone we have the discussion again. So disturbances are creating always discussions about how to manage it, how to save the nature, how to proceed with the area. As you probably know from direct hand, a picture also taken here in Białowieża Forest about those discussions. And there's a couple of things which are always evident in these discussions, particularly matching the title or the scope of the conference actually, that discussions always are very emotional and always lack support by scientific data, and it's always quickly moved to an emotional and political level instead of being closely tied to management goals and scientific data we have. In my talk, I would just highlight a few things sequentially to disturbance. So once it comes to a disturbance by, let's say, insect, beetle, or moth, basically you lose the canopy, some of the trees are killed, and commonly there's some management, removing parts of the dead trees, sometimes keeping parts of the dead trees, and sometimes keeping survivors or any other kinds of structural key features or biological legacies. So I will have a look on the effects of disturbance on biodiversity, but also on the effects of additional disturbance by human, like salvage logging, for instance, on biodiversity. And I would like to draw attention to structures in disturbed forests, because I think they are key to preserve biodiversity in intensively managed disturbed areas, or in doubly disturbed areas, and they could make a good contribution to protect biodiversity. So moving to the first step, natural disturbance and biodiversity, we all are fascinated by species occurring in naturally disturbed forests, like Melanophila acuminata, which is common here, as I already learned, and it's depending on burned trees. It actually has an infrared organ to be able to detect burned timber, and where I'm working now, we, like recently, last year, we found it again, like re-found it, re-recorded it on a very small patch of burnt forest that we have below. It's a picture from the Bavarian forest. It's actually a Natura 2000 species, the redstart, which we typically have in light forests, or it's or in orchards actually, but you can also have it in disturbed beetle-killed forests as here. If you look to the large-scale response of across taxonomic groups, you can see that there is kind of winners and losers. So taxonomic groups which have the mean response right hand from the dashed line typically increase in species richness by disturbances, and left hand of the line, those are the losers, to say, who lose species richness by natural disturbances. If you synthesize across, okay, there is winners and losers, and taxonomic groups benefiting typically include groups that benefit from increasing deadwood amounts and especially from increasing sun exposure of disturbed areas, so from more warming forests and from just from more sunlight to the ground, and sometimes also from the increasing amount of flowering plants which can grow after the major canopy has died. It's a bit interesting that down here you typically have groups have high species richness in, let's say, somewhat dark and moist forests. But as you can see here, the responses are only for mollusks and epicake lichens. We had like significant change in species richness. Sorry. When it comes to ecological theory, there's one very famous theory that you probably have all heard about, the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, which received mixed scientific support during the last decade, actually, because some studies found there is no effect, the pattern does not occur. Some studies found exactly those patterns that with increasing environmental stress or increasing management intensity, you have the highest species richness at intermediate levels of disturbance or management intensity. Although the theory was claimed to be dead several times, it popped up at least as much as this was already thought to be dead. And we used the data that we put together for those syntheses to actually test if we found support for the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. And it turned out that with disturbance severity, we had more or less the pattern that we expected, like 60-something % of trees killed. Here, the disturbance severity matches the trees killed by disturbance on the stand level. Yeah, and if you look to the results, like statistically controlled for everything else, taxonomic group, year since disturbance on, it matched quite well. But what you actually can argue is that we are having different patterns acting on the stand and the landscape level, right? So you can also say that an intermediate disturbance is if like 50% of stands in a landscape scale are killed by disturbances, right? And not only the intensity within a stand. So we used a second approach to test this and to actually figure out what species drive these changes, and that is what you can see here. Again, on the landscape scale is some kind of humpback shape with peaking somewhere in the middle at medium disturbance extents. And of course, the more disturbance you have, the more disturbance species you will find, and at the same time, the more forest species you will lose until like species of dark old forest. It's important to say that those are still forest species, right? You would normally expect them in very open or very deadwood rich forests, since these very early several stages of forest succession still belong to forests. But I think the thing is, what's actually new is that we are currently facing more and more disturbances, which you can see here on these pictures is actually increasing each year by 1.5% since the last decades. So we have more disturbance, and we also have like more intense disturbance on a landscape scale. If you can see here, especially in Central Europe, like Czech Republic, Germany, Northern Italy, Austria, Poland, we have much more intense disturbance that we would normally expect just from the medium or just from the mean increase per year. And that's quite new because with that in mind, you have to keep in mind that we are discussing about this end here more and more, right? For instance, in Germany, we had a serious drought from 2018 onwards. Probably it was a bit similar in Poland as well. And that triggered outbreaks of bark beetles and quite some loss of spruces in central Germany, especially these parts. I'm aware of several like forestry enterprises, state forestry enterprises, who technically have no more adult spruce in the whole, let's 20, 30,000 hectare they are in charge of management. So that's actually new that we are at this edge. And if we think back to a more conceptual way, if we want to predict changes by such high or such intense disturbances, and if we want to be like scientifically ahead of what happens actually by disturbances, we would definitely need more experimental setups that could predict the disturbance effects on biodiversity. And that's quite tricky, I think, because it's very difficult actually to plan natural disturbances. And if a forest fire happens, it happens often in a way that it's not like really nice, statistically super awesome design. It's just like running for one night and then you end up with a burned forest, right? But for instance, we tried to have the interactive effect of disturbances and global warming by using existing disturbance spot and additionally open top chambers, which were able to heat basically for 1 to 2 degrees in mean the air temperature. So we could track seedling survivals with disturbance and with additional change in climate. And I think this combination of existing survey and monitoring data or existing disturbance sites with some small experimental plots could really help to address gaps in knowledge that we have. Particularly, as Alex has pointed out in this review, there is a lack in sufficient designs that allow to test the combined effect of disturbance and logging, for instance. Because typically the designs we have are usually either forest and disturbed forest or disturbed forest and logged forest, but we lack a bit those designs which cover all them. And of course we are lacking them because it's not so easy to conduct it actually. So if we come to salvage logging now, it's typically what it looks with and without salvage logging. Here's a picture of the Bavarian Forest National Park, like the buffer zone, just to show that there's also logging. Yeah, take some pictures. There's logging in German national parks as well. And what's happening is that from around 300 cubic meters of dead wood, you decrease around to 70, 50. So you decrease it by 5 times, 6 times. Again, the broad picture is has winners and losers. Again, similar figure as I showed before. You got the winners on the right-hand side, losers on the left side. And on the top winners, you typically found taxonomic groups which like even more sunlight, which benefit from bare soil, like epigeal spiders or carabids. And on the loser sides, you find all those groups that somewhat depend on dead wood, like subroxylic beetles, wood inhabiting fungi, but even birds who are adapted to utilize the structures like snags, like fallen trees. If you like completely get rid of those structures, they suffer as well as even if they don't develop in deadwood, right? The interesting thing is, which connects to human dimensions, that salvage logging happens also often in protected areas. As you can see here, I will quickly explain it. The colors indicate the type of disturbance: red fire, blue wind, and orange bark beetle. And the small paragraph sign here inside, for instance, it indicates if it took place in a disturbed area. And the let's pie chart around indicate how much amount of the disturbed timber was actually removed by salvage logging. And for instance, as you can see here, some Central European protected area and bark beetle damage, there was around 1/3 of the timber volume disturbed was removed. Or here, let's say 70% removed from protected area. And so it's a pretty much mix, and it's still an argument that is often used. We have to safeguard the forest, we have to protect the forest, whatever. And it's commonly used to undermine the goals of protected area. Just recently, we have discussions about how to best manage damaged oak forests. And we have a very famous conservation forests in Germany with a lot of oaks. And even if there was little timber removal during the last year, now with this discussion and forest protection, they removed 6,000 or 7,000 cubic meters of timber from there, which is quite a lot. If you look to the reasons then why it's conducted, of course, the timber value, and especially in Central Europe, reasons of pest control. So even in Germany, we are legally forced actually to remove bark beetle damaged trees to protect nearby forests. But interesting, it's also like restoration, aesthetics, fuel reduction. So there is still somewhat the mood that we need to restore the forest by removing deadwood. As my friend Alex Leverkus once said to me, you and your deadwood, it's regarded as a kind of ecosystem garbage. We have to remove it. And that's pretty interesting, because I think if you think, or if most people think actually of old growth, valuable forests with a lot of charismatic species, that is probably what we have in mind, right? It's a closed canopy, it's somewhat deadwood, and it looks a bit wild. It doesn't match this picture actually, where everything is in chaos and it looks scrappy, and there's wind-felled trees, there's bark beetle infested trees, somebody is trying to clean it all up. There's simply a huge mismatch, and there is actually a few research on human dimension and the perception of deadwood. And we adapted a few of those methods to see how people actually react to dead trees. What we did is we used one of the pictures from the Bavarian forest, photoshopped some hiking trail in there, and then asked people, where would you feel, where would your personal perceived well-being be highest? Is it like 100% trees, nice and green, or is it 103% of the trees killed? So, and they could rate themselves where they would locate their well-being themselves on this like hiking trail here. And we did that with more than 1,000 German inhabitants, like stratified sampling by age and gender. And that is actually the result. And what you could see is like in median or in mean, people would like to have at least 70% of the trees green. And was really interesting to us, because like 30% of the tree that matches what we know from selective logging, for instance. If there is 30% of the trees in a stand removed, you will not much recognize it, because the canopy still looks somewhat closed. It's maybe a bit lighter, but you don't recognize a real strong impact if you walk to this forest. So, of course, we did some statistical analysis with that to explain actually what explains the number of living trees. And the first thing we addressed was Is it maybe education, or is it somewhat connected to if you have seen it before, if you like to collect beetles on dead trees? And it turned out that national park visitors who have visited a national park before, where you have significant damage by bark beetles, they tended to tolerate larger number of dead trees, which is quite a nice finding because that's one of the IUCN goals for national parks and protected area. And we also found that like higher educated people, or people with higher final degree, they tend to visit national parks more often, but there was no direct effect, I would say. And then from environmental psychology, there is several scales which attempt to measure like if you prefer to preserve ecosystem, or if you more on the side to utilize as much as you can to produce timber and so on. And we adopted these measures, and that was really interesting to us, because people that like to preserve ecosystems, then they were they want in mean more green trees, right? And people that feel themselves connected with nature more, they also want more green trees. So that means that even the people which rate themselves as very connected to nature, they don't want dead wood and dead trees in the forests. And that's quite interesting. That's also findings that match other findings from Austria, for instance, that especially those people who would say that they are connected to nature and somewhat come from an ecological perspective, they don't like to have dead wood. And just to make the picture complete, of course, it's also driven by age and gender, male versus female. For instance, you can see that men like to utilize the forest more than women and end up more here. But it's actually those values who mediate the personal values here. There is no direct effect. And that's what we have to keep in mind if we discuss about how to manage best disturbed forests. There's a lot of beliefs and thoughts about how to manage it. And it's also some advice to us, like to push education and to, for instance, show people like we had the walk yesterday in the Białowieża forest to show how the natural dynamics in forests work. So it's key to understand that, and I think education is key, and national park visits, for instance, to get a more evidence-based picture of what forest disturbance and effects of disturbance to biodiversity actually look like. So the last point here is the forest structures actually in disturbed forest. Again, some picture from the Bavarian Forest National Park, where you have a bark beetle outbreak. That's quite an older area, but you can still see a lot of snakes, which are between 10 and 20 years old. You can see living spruces, you can see regenerating spruces, you see some beech tree here. It's a picture from autumn, so it's just autumn colors. And you can also see some beech which apparently has left already all the leaves. So this is how it typically looks in a very nicely patched and structured way. And I brought a few examples on how these structures actually drive species response to disturbances. First, since it's a mammal institute, I thought it's good to have at least one slide with a mammal here. So that's the Barbus tailbat, which is even if it's a small mammal, which is quite common in these higher elevations in the Bavarian forest. And we did we surveyed them with different techniques, including radio telemetry. And then in the first step, we actually compared the roost tree, where we found the maternity colonies, to the two trees nearby. And it turned out that they, in mean, preferred the tree with a diameter larger than compared to the next tree. And that is actually what it looked like. This was one of the trees where we had 16 individuals just beneath these loose bark. And you can imagine that in this landscape, we have probably millions of this roosting type of this tree cavity. The next step we undertook was we compared the surrounding of the tree to randomly selected trees around in the same area. I think we ended up with around 20 roost trees, and we selected some 40 random trees and used LiDAR data to show it. And it turned that they used to select not the completely closed stand, but also not the completely open stand. So they did not select snags or dead trees solely on open area. Always some at the forest or edge and in mediumly covered. We assume that it's because of the thermostability, because you don't have these super high changes in the temperature inside the roost tree. And then the last thing, we also looked at the hunting habitats. So we had bat quarters there and did acoustic surveys. And here it nicely shows that the bats actually use these bark beetle areas for hunting quite a lot, and not the super dense forests, because those species are somewhat specialized on nocturnal moth, and they could easily approach them in the a bit more open areas. And the openings were created by the bark beetle. So you can see that on different stages, they act, the disturbance act on influencing the species habitat and the way they use it. Yeah, next example is the capercaillie. It's another iconic charismatic species and protected in Germany by several laws. And here we used the advantage to combine aerial photography time series over 20 years together with citizen science data, collected the droppings of the capercaillie in the winter. So we had a nice distribution map with findings of the capercaillie, and we combined that actually with the LiDAR data and aerial photographs. And it turned out that disturbances open the forest, so you got more herbs, and since the capercaillie like eating berries like these blueberries, vaccinium, we had more capercaillie records created by disturbances through this path. But of course, if the succession moves on, the herb layer gets more and more closed, or does not get that much light actually, then it closes, and then we have less capercaillie records due to increasing shrub layer basically. But since the disturbance creates this nice mosaic, it can always like step, and has always some nice habitats. We repeated the analysis also for the hazel grouse dropping, and the hazel grouse is a species that prefers these very dense shrubby birch forest trees, and there we find exactly the opposite picture. So it nicely demonstrates how those two species interact in the disturbed landscape. And another example, now with a very meaningful group of species, of course, comes from colleagues from Prague, where they have long-term data of disturbance chronology actually sampled in Eastern Europe and in the Balkan. And they addressed the question how those historical disturbance actually drive or determine what we recently found in the communities of sacrobacillic beetles. So they have those 4 key variables of disturbances: disturbance severity, time since the last disturbance, frequency, and the disturbance severity of the maximum disturbances. And they've tested how this all affected the forest structures. Like, of course, there are very evident paths here, but there's also still something that you can't catch very much by those predictors, like the trem diversity. So the diversity of tree microhabitats in the forest was hard to predict actually, but key features like the lying deadwood, openness of the canopy, and standing deadwood, mean age was really nicely explained by the disturbance. And then if you look to all different kind of aspects of diversity, you end up with this complicated picture. And it turns out that actually different facets of biodiversity of those beetles were influenced by different structures. So it's actually not that easy to predict how, for instance, phylogenetic diversity or functional diversity or even abundance of beetle communities responds. That's a super diverse group and super heterogeneous ecosystems. You quickly end up with a very complicated picture, which makes absolutely sense from an ecological perspective, and it's a very holistic approach. But if you then move to conservation, you will quickly get the question, okay, but how should we put this in the conservation? Tell me how should I manage my forest, and you can't explain that in a very simple way to forest managers or in a very catchy way to forest managers or guys that drive the harvester, if they should manage the forest or if they should aim to preserve some tree. And of course, that's somewhat related also to the experimental designs that we have, because if you want to bring things in management, the forest managers also often ask, okay, then tell me how much should I leave there? How much structures, how much area, how much dead trees? Can we have a really simple and broad guideline how to manage this? Because, of course, it's good to know all this background, but at the end you need course rules of thumb to bring it really on the ground. And due to other research, we already confirmed that in the case of subaxillary beetles, the amount of dead wood is, of course, a good proxy for the structures, because the more you have, the higher the probability you catch more of the structures. The more dead wood you have, it's statistically more likely that you have different tree species or different decay stages or different sun exposures. So the amount is quite striking if it comes to develop conservation measures. The tricky thing is that we are lacking still experimental designs who captured that in the landscapes, because we typically have these black and white pictures, completely locked, completely unlocked. And that's, of course, the simple way. As we yesterday heard from John Linnell in the talk, the majority of our forests are in any kind of management at the moment, and they will definitely stay in this between black and white approach. So it's actually hard to say, okay, you have to leave 50% of disturbance, or you should leave 20% of disturbance to preserve a given amount of biodiversity, because we are simply lacking designs to test that. So we digged again in the synthesis data and compiled and these data about disturbance effect on biodiversity. Michael, you can see there's some Smichowski here, and Durska is also from Poland. So Poland was really keen in providing data, and I had the great opportunity to work together with An Chao in Taiwan, who is definitely one of the most amazing persons and scientists I had the pleasure to work with. And we were dealing about how could we maybe statistically address this issue of what data we have, and can we still provide some really robust measure of how many forests we should preserve after disturbance. And I remember really well when she showed up in the office at Monday morning and put this sheet on my desk and said, "Simon, I have good news for you. I found the solution for your problem." While I was staring at that sheet, she said, "I couldn't sleep because the math is so beautiful." And as you see, everything become clear and easy then. And what's actually behind those behind these formulas is the mix of two rarefaction extrapolation curves, right? You can statistically sample from two different habitat types, put it together, and then rarefy or accumulate the species richness. So we just use these global data set, put it to here, and end up with this curve, which I just transformed to percentages here and also here, depicting if you keep 100% of a given disturbed area, preserve it from logging, you will of course have 100% of specialist disturbance species. But actually the shape of this curve, it's what is making interesting, because if you have just two coarse rule of thumbs, If you exclude 50% area from logging, you have still, you just lose 1/4 of the species of the disturbance specialist, or vice versa. If you want to preserve 90% of the disturbance specialists, you need to exclude 3/4 of the disturbance area from logging. And the nice thing about that approach, especially to me, is it does not make any assumptions about the spatial configuration, right? It is just a coarse mean, which means that if you are in charge of managing the forest, you can also decide, okay, I will take the timber that is next road, or I will take this cut block because there's already logging trails, and you will still be in the range of the confidence band here. Of course, we have it also for different species groups, and we have it for saproxylic and non-saproxylic species again. And the curve differs always because, for instance, for saproxylic species, you would need to preserve higher values. But with this at hand, you can have a evidence-based rule of thumb how to deal with a disturbance event. And especially important, you don't know how your forest act before the disturbance will hit it, because let's say there was no major flooding events in the Białowieża forest, just as an example, and you of course don't know the effects of this specific disturbance in that forest type, and that's why I think these data sets can make a valuable contribution to that, because due to this large number of replicates and due to the confidence band provided by like meta-analysis or by those statistics, you can be sure that the effects of an unknown disturbance will be in this 95% confidence band, roughly. So I'm coming to the end of my talk, and I have just brought some conclusions, some of them already mentioned. I think it's key to get the human dimensions here more in the management of disturbances, and also to benchmarking legacy to foster biodiversity. And actually the small figures I had also in this review from Alex, Disturb to Avoid Disturbance, where there's put together all the scientific evidence and also a bit of the gaps in knowledge. I thank you very much for your attention and also for having me here, and I'm happy to take your questions.